Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's alumni webinar. My name is Emma Maynard, and I'm the Assistant Director of Career and Network Programming here in the Office of Alumni Relations. Today's webinar is brought to you by the JMU Alumni Association. We're excited to bring you this alumni webinar program with the goal of providing career-related resources that help you conveniently cultivate your professional self. I first want to say thank you to everybody for participating today. We're really excited for this topic, and we hope that you'll gain a lot from it today. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to cover some brief housekeeping notes. If you are participating live, please note that your microphones are muted for our presentation. However, you do have some chat options, so make sure that your chat feature is brought down. During the presentation, as you have questions of our presenter, you can use the Q&A feature and send those directly to me, Emma Maynard, the host, and I'll be sure to share those at the end of the presentation. You can also use the chat option during the presentation if you'd like to engage in real time with your fellow Dukes by selecting all participants, typing in your comments, and selecting send. We would also love to see you live tweet during the webinar. We've had some really fun tweets that went out in our previous presentations about what our alumni are learning in real time. So we'd love to see you join in on that using hashtag JMUAAwebinar as well as hashtag JMU. And those are also provided for you in the chat feature. This webinar will be recorded, and you will be able to access it on our website under our Career and Networking section, along with our other presentations that we have featured. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter. Besides being an alumna of JMU, Christine is a licensed mental health counselor by the state of Florida and a national certified counselor with over 15 years of experience in counseling, teaching, and ministry. She specializes in personality disorders, mental health disorders, addictions, ADD, OCD, codependency, anxiety, anger, depression, parenting, and marriage. She is a mentor, speaker, and author of the Exhausted Women's Handbook. She also has a professional blog on PsychCentral.com, an international website. Christine has been married to her husband, Michael, a local attorney for over 20 years, and has lived in the Orlando area for 20-plus years. They have a son in the military and 2 teenage daughters, and you can visit her website at growwithchristine.com. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to Christine to deliver today's alumni webinar presentation.
Thank you so much, Emma. It is such a pleasure to be able to be with all of you today. I'm so looking forward to be able to share with you some of the things that I have learned along the way. And just listening to that lovely bio of mine already makes me feel a little bit exhausted because it sounds like I've done a whole lot. And in reality, I haven't made as much success as I would like to, but I really am grateful for the things that I learned growing up and going to JMU and all of the lovely life lessons that it taught me along the way. But one of the things that I truly love is the cherry blossom trees, and we're going to use the image of a tree throughout our entire discussion today because I think that a tree in and of itself is a great representation of what our life really looks like. And I often have my clients think about their life in terms of a tree, where the trunk is your main part of your life, your branches are like the various roles that you have within your life, and your roots are where you get your nourishment from and your foundation from. So for me, in springtime in DC, the tree is just very significant and meaningful to me. So we're going to be talking about 3 different areas of exhaustion that I've learned about over the years. There was a time in my life when I was completely and totally worn out, and I couldn't quite figure out where that exhaustion was coming from. I was very good at managing my schedule. Even though I had 3 kids, a husband, and a professional life, I seemed to have everything in order and was able to keep on top of it, but I couldn't seem to get away from this gnawing feeling that I was completely worn out all the time. I tried getting more sleep, I tried exercising, I tried eating right, and yet nothing really seemed to take care of it for me. That's when I discovered that exhaustion had a lot more to do with the things that were going on inside me and around me than it did with what my physical circumstances were. So I started to be able to understand the concept that your behavior and how you feel is driven by what you think and what you feel. So for instance, I had a dad growing up that was very OCD, and he had this little white glove treatment that he would do where you would have to run your hand with a white glove over a dusted area. And if there was even one speck of dust on any surface, then you had to redust the entire thing. It was very exhausting growing up from that, but the anxiety that I got from having to live in that environment created anxiety that was in me later on in life. And it manifested itself in how I treated my kids for a very long time. That contributed a lot to my exhaustion. And we're going to talk a little bit more about obsessive thinking later on. Then the other thing that causes some exhaustion is unresolved trauma. And my first marriage, not to my husband Michael, but to someone else, was an abusive relationship that didn't last very long. And what I didn't realize at the time was that that unresolved trauma carried itself with me many years later. And even though I was outside of the situation where I was no longer being abused, some of the triggers of things that people would say and do would just all of a sudden hit me, and I would have this weird anger that would come out of nowhere. That also was increasing my level of exhaustion. And then lastly, the other area was from difficult people and just having to manage the difficult people in your life. I went to my grandmother's 100-year-old birthday party several years ago. It was a great time of being able to celebrate and seeing my family that I don't get to see very often. And what I noticed when I looked around the room was just how many, and I'm sure y'all don't have this, but I do, how many difficult people there were really in that room that day. And some of them were not very nice. Some of them were very nice. Some of them were over the top. But when you looked around the room, you could see a couple narcissists, some paranoid people. We had some addicts. We had some codependent people and some very anxious people in the room. And being around that level of difficulty also increased my exhaustion. So those are the three areas that we're going to be talking more about today. What I would like to do is have you look at this picture. I had one of my favorite things to do with clients is to have them draw a picture of their life in the form of a tree. So I had a client do this. And when she drew her picture, oh, I'm sorry, it's going the wrong way. Let me fix that real quick. I don't know why we're going that way. There we go. When I have her draw this picture of her tree, we couldn't quite figure out what was going on in her life. And then she drew this picture, and we could all of a sudden start to see the differences between her life as being very positive and then her life as being very negative. And what we didn't realize at the time was that she had an undiagnosed bipolar disorder. And as she started to draw this and we started to talk about it more and more, we started to realize that the reason it was so undiagnosed was because it was what we call rapid cycling, where she was cycling every other day. And it was only through this image of the tree that we were really able to see what was happening in her life. So it is a concept that I ask my clients to do, but it's also something that you can do with yourself, where you can draw a picture of your tree and then notice any differences in it. Notice where there's like maybe a hole in the trunk, or maybe there's a lack of support from underneath. Or perhaps there's some leaves that are missing on part of a tree, or their branches are kind of short like this one and a little bit stunted, or perhaps their weather is very different. And do your own self-analysis to kind of get an idea of where you are. So what I'd like to talk about is what I call the first step, which is the exhaustion triangle. So our behavior is made up of two components: your feelings and your thoughts. So how you feel determines your behavior, as well as how you think determining your behavior. So two areas that contribute greatly to exhaustion are feelings of inadequacy and obsessive thinking. We're going to focus first on the obsessive thinking aspect of it. let's go back to my obsessive compulsive dad for a second. One of the things that we struggled with was that when he would come over to visit our house, and this is me as an adult, I would be like a mad woman. I would be running around the house, telling everybody what to do, how to clean, how to organize. I'd act like an absolute lunatic with my family. And it used to drive my kids insane. In fact, I'm fairly certain that I have caused significant trauma to them to this very day over my behavior. And what I started to realize was that my thinking that I had, the obsessive thinking about everything having to be a certain way and look a certain way, was not really who I was. In fact, that was who my dad was. But I was taking it on as if it was me. And the end result was just complete exhaustion for me. And I wasn't able to relax and really enjoy his presence even. So that level of obsessive thinking is what drove me to levels of exhaustion that weren't healthy. So let's talk about like some examples of what obsessive thinking looks like. One of them is replaying the same conversation over and over in your head, except that you're not getting any new insight with it. You just keep saying it again and again and again. And that kind of obsessive thinking can really exhaust a person. There is also fantasizing what we call super you responses. In other words, you didn't say what you wanted to say in the moment, or you didn't do what you wanted to do. And so you have this fantasy in your head of what you could have said or could have done. And that also adds to exhaustion. The third thing is imagining horrific scenarios with negative outcomes. So my grandmother was very famous for this when I was growing up. She would imagine the most horrific scenarios, and then everybody had to jump through all these hoops because if she didn't turn around the car, then the house was going to burn down because she forgot to turn off the stove. And that kind of level of obsessive thinking is very, very tiring. Number 4, envisioning anger rants that don't produce any relief or any better perception. So sometimes instead of envisioning positive outcomes, we actually envision ourselves getting angry. And it sounds so strange, but we all do it from time to time, where we actually envision that we should have gotten angry in a scenario. We didn't get angry. So, but just imagining that we're getting angry is enough to actually get our blood pressure going and our heart rate pumping faster, and it can create and generate its own level of anxiety. Number 5 is judging actions of others and condemning them. That is obsessive thinking, when you're thinking about what other people are doing all the time and then you're condemning them for their behavior or what they said or what they did. Number 6 is retelling the same story obsessively, usually with a little bit more of exaggeration every single time. So it's not the exact same, but it just kind of like gets stretched every single time. That's obsessive thinking. Number 7 is assuming the worst possible meaning in a comment, note, text, or body language. And we all do this from time to time, where you'll get a text and somebody will say something and maybe they accidentally hit their all caps, and so we assume that they're shouting at us when really maybe they didn't really mean to shout at us the way that it came across. But then we obsess about it. Well, why would they be shouting at us? Why are they doing this? And it just replays in the head constantly. Number 8, rationalizing excessive responsibility and taking it on as a result of somebody else's failure. So sometimes people rationalize the responsibility, and they actually take on what somebody else is really responsible for. This is very typical in like an addict household, where we find that the addict won't be responsible for getting to work on time. They'll dump the responsibility on their spouse for waking them up so that they can make it to work on time. Number 9 is pondering negative comments and dismissing all positive statements. So sometimes we do this when we might be presenting something like today, where if I were to obsess over one negative comment and then ignore all of the positive comments, that would not be healthy either. That is obsessive thinking. And number 10, deliberating past choices and decisions to the point of driving others crazy. So that is obsessive thinking, when you keep like focusing on something over and over and over again that you have done or made a decision about, and we can't redo that, and then you literally drive other people mad in that. So instead of obsessively thinking about something, it's better to look at it as this way. Is it true, helpful, inspiring, necessary, and kind? So every thought that pops into your head, you can actually run through this scenario of, is it a true statement? Meaning, did this really happen? Could this really happen? Is it a realistic possibility? Is it helpful? In other words, does it help me to grow, learn, understand? Or is it really helping me to create more anxiety or anger? Is it inspiring? Does it encourage me in some kind of way? Does it help me to grow? Or does it put me down? Is it necessary? Meaning that, is it necessary to actually go here? Like, what is the realistic possibility that this is actually going to happen? And then last, is it kind? We sometimes forget that, we might not say something to our own best friend, but we're willing to say that negative comment to ourselves. And that's not really fair. The comment should be equal on both sides of that. So the other part of feeling exhausted is feelings of inadequacy. I see a lot of this in counseling in particular. Like, these are some very common statements that I hear people saying. They'll say things like they're not good enough, that they can't do anything right, they have no talents, they don't do enough, I'm hopeless, I have no purpose. It is a very common negative statements that they say about themselves where they don't feel in some kind of way that they are adequate. That lack of adequacy, or that feeling that you're not good enough, is actually rooted in fear. And I love this acronym because it's so true, false evidence appearing real. So that's really what fear is. It's false evidence of something happening that appears to be way more real than what it actually is. So fear kind of signals for us a fight or flight response in the brain. So the second we start to feel fear, we have that, should I fight it or should I run? So there's three different kinds of fears that are our primary focus fears that we look at. Number one is fear of failure. So in the fear of failure, we're looking at, are we going to get ruined somehow? Are we going to disappoint others? Are we going to lose control in some way, shape, or form? So we're afraid that we are actually going to fail in some way. It could be with a work situation, it could be professional, it could be financial. It's a fear of failure. The next one is fear of rejection. Fear of rejection is pretty big for a lot of people because that is a fear of intimacy. It's a fear of being hurt by others. It's a fear of embarrassment. So fear of rejection is very relationally oriented. So people are afraid of actually closeness. They're afraid of social situations. They're afraid of being made a fool of. And these things can lead them to feel that sense of inadequacy. And last is fear of abandonment. I see a lot of this in cases where people grow up in single-parent households, or they had a parent who passed away, or they had a parent who was not there because they were a workaholic, or they had a divorce situation where one parent wasn't present a lot. So they have a sense of abandonment by that parent, and that kind of lives with them for a long time unless that issue is actually resolved. And then they feel at some level that they were not adequate enough, that had they been better, that this parent actually wouldn't have done what they did. And it's a sad story, but it's very true and happens a lot in situations. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is unresolved trauma, and that's a perfect lead-in, the fear of abandonment, to unresolved trauma, because the way to overcome all of this is actually when you have that sense of feeling inadequate, you have to resolve the trauma that's underneath it, because fear is always manifesting itself in some level of trauma that you might have experienced. For me personally, probably one of the most traumatic things that I had to go through was my best friend committing suicide. It happened 17 years ago, 3 months and 11 days ago, and I still remember that day as if it was yesterday. It is one of the most significant days in my entire life, and it was very gut-wrenching because she was such a special person to me, and I knew that she was suffering. I knew she wasn't doing well, but I didn't know how bad it really was at that moment. So when I got the news that she had committed suicide, I had to step in and really help her family deal with it. Her parents were ashamed and embarrassed by the suicide, so a couple friends and I wound up having to set up the entire funeral and do all the arrangements for our friend because her family refused to do anything. So not only was there trauma as a result of her death, but there was trauma as a result of the way that her family handled the matter. And it was very difficult having to call all of her friends and relatives and past schoolmates to inform them of her passing. And all of that left quite a mark on me and an impact on me going forward, which is why I've always taken suicide and threats of suicide so seriously, even in my practice. So that is what we call a life-altering moment. If you look at the rings of a tree, so again, going back to the concept of a tree, the very trunk of a tree, if you slice it in half and you open it up, it exposes the rings. And the various rings are determined by all kinds of weather forces, by trauma that happens to the tree, by the changes in environment. If they're in Florida, we have hurricanes, so hurricanes absolutely affect the growth of a tree. You can actually see trees growing sideways as a result of a past hurricane that came through. Fires can destroy trees, bugs, insects, all kinds of things can cause damage and affect what the actual rings of the tree look like. So in my case, my friend's suicide was definitely a ring that you can visibly see in the tree of my life. I would encourage you to do the same thing with your own life so that you actually take a moment to kind of like look at and think about what are the high points and the low points in your life. So you can organize that for yourself in understanding exactly what are the moments that really inspired you, encouraged you, that made you very happy, versus some of the low points in your life that made you very sad, and understanding that not everybody's points are going to be the same. So for instance, when my son got deployed overseas, that was definitely a low point for me, I just have to say. Now, it was a high point for my son because he was beyond thrilled that he was getting to go overseas, but I was not so thrilled that he is overseas right now. So we're exactly at the opposite ends of the spectrum of a life-altering event, and that will be true. You can each experience the same thing and have a different walk away from it. So a couple of examples of what I'm talking about is like a low point. I had a friend of mine go through cancer recently. That was clearly a low point in her life. We have gone through deaths of friends and families, of siblings, their disabilities, but some of the high points could be like the birth of children, building a new house, having all kinds of moving, even retiring can be an exciting moment for some people. So there's high points and low points to everyone's life. Knowing what yours are and what your triggers are will help you to determine exactly where you might be exhausted from later on. But probably one of the most exhausting things that a person goes through is abuse. And there are 7 different ways that a person can be abused. And the reason I like to focus on this is because so many times we forget that abuse is more than just physical. A lot of times we focus on just the physical, and I know from working with, we call it DCF here, which is the Department of Children and Family Services, and they help us when we find out that a child has been suspected of abuse, but it's only 2 forms of abuse. It's physical abuse, so something that you notice, and neglect. Well, that's not always the cases that we're looking at. A lot of times there's other types of abuse. So one of them is mental abuse. Mental abuse is like silence, giving somebody the silent treatment, not talking to them for a long period of time, manipulating somebody into doing something, victimizing someone, or gaslighting. And gaslighting is a term that comes from a 1950s movie called Gaslighting, in which you had a man who manipulated his wife into thinking that she was going crazy, and then had her sent to a funny farm when actually, that's what they called it back then, and when actually she was not going crazy. So what she saw was real, but he kept saying that what you're seeing is imagined, and so he was gaslighting her. That's a form of mental abuse. Verbal abuse is screaming, at somebody else, bullying them, name-calling, berating, blaming somebody for something that wasn't really their fault. Emotional abuse is another type of abuse. That is intense anxiety and a lot of guilt, some confusion, shame, anger, hostility, rejection, and even fear. So a person who uses emotional abuse uses those emotions against a person. For instance, they might incite fear in a person unnecessarily as a way to get them to act or do something. Going back to physical, physical is more than just hitting somebody. It's isolating them, physically isolating them, restraining them, not allowing them to leave, using physical aggression, intimidation, which could be like standing over somebody and looking down on them, and endangerment, endangering their life in some kind of way, putting them in harm's way that is damaging. There's also financial abuse. Financial abuse is stealing. So I've had some clients who have experienced this where a family member has stolen from another family member large sums of money, destroying assets, hiding resources, in other words, hiding funds and money from one spouse to another, refusing access, not allowing your spouse to have access to funds, falsifying records. That could be anything. It could be birth certificates. It could be marriage certificates. It could be insurance or tax documents, and interfering with work environments, meaning that a person goes in and tries to disrupt somebody else's work environment so that they're no longer able to stay employed. That is financial abuse. Then there's sexual abuse. Sexual abuse includes jealousy rages, so raging over the fact that somebody might be with somebody else when there's just absolutely no evidence for it. Coercion, so coercing somebody into having sex when they don't really want to do it. Sexual withdrawal, not having sex at all and refusing to have it. Rape, of course, and any degrading acts that you force another person into doing when they don't really want to do it. And last is spiritual. And spiritual abuse looks like dichotomous thinking. So that is very black and white thinking. It's either my way or the highway. A lot of prejudice, some elitist beliefs, believing that you're better than other people, demanding submission from a certain group of people, excommunicating people who don't belong to your group because they didn't act and behave the way that you expected them to, and estrangement. So those are the 7 ways that people can be abused: physical, mental, verbal, emotional, financial, sexual, and spiritual. All of those can lead to an enormous amount of exhaustion in a person. When you come across somebody who has been abused, it's a natural desire to want to help them out of that situation. And one of the best ways that you can do that to be supportive of them is to name the type of abuse that they have experienced. So help them to see that some of the abuse that they're experiencing really is verbal abuse, and calling it verbal abuse instead of just saying, oh yeah, they were yelling at you. Being specific about it. Then diagnosing kind of what their behavior is. Why are they acting this way? What is going on? What is happening in the circumstances? Where is this stemming from? Recognize the abuser's patterns. An abusive person always leaves patterns. They do the same thing over and over again. Because if something works one time, they're going to do it again. So they'll constantly repeat the exact same pattern. So that makes it a lot easier to kind of figure out, well, what's their trigger? What's triggering them and what's causing this abuse to happen? They seem to get this way when they feel out of control, when they feel like they've been embarrassed, when they feel like they are not in charge in some kind of way. So what is it that's actually causing or triggering the abuse that's happening? Then you can help a person to strategize. I see when a person gets into an abusive situation, I kind of see it as a game of chess. And not to minimize or demoralize anybody who is going through this, but if you step outside of the emotion of the abuse and you look at it as a chess game and see, well, they move their pieces forward this way and I'm going to move my pieces that way, and so that you are constantly playing both defense and offense at the exact same time. Because the idea at the end of this is that a person walks away from an abusive situation with their dignity intact. I don't want to see them lose all of a sense of who they are in the process. I want to see them gain some strength along the way. And the best way to do that is to help them see that they can strategize and that they can make some plans moving forward. And that they do have some, for instance, here's the next one, some boundaries that they can set. And that they are able to set some boundaries and make some headway. I also ask people who are in an abusive situation to have an exit plan, to look at how to escape, how to get out of it, and what they're actually going to do, to have a support, tell a close friend or a relative, preferably not a parent situation or a child situation. Perhaps a cousin is best in a scenario like this, or an aunt or uncle who can keep things private. But usually have a very small circle of friends, 1, 2 max, that know what's going on, so that they can be not only a support but help you when the time comes. When somebody's been abused for a while, it almost always is necessary for them to move away, not just across town. Sometimes it helps to be able to move out of town to get fully away, because even just walking into a grocery store that they normally walked into, if they've been abused for years on end, could be a triggering situation. And along with abuse comes lots of PTSD. We were very fortunate in that the DSM in its last revision came out with a diagnosis of PTSD for victims who have been abused over a long period of time, so that we can now see and diagnose them correctly as having this ongoing anxiety. But unfortunately, the PTSD doesn't usually hit until after they've gotten away, which is so strange to most people, that once they've escaped an abusive situation, you would think it would get better, but it doesn't right away. It actually gets worse for a while, because they have all this stuff that starts rising to the surface that they have to process and get out. And all new relationships going forward need to be checked in order to make sure that the victim doesn't wind up in the exact same scenario again. Because if they don't get healing from this along the way, the likelihood that they will repeat with a different kind of abuser is fairly high, unfortunately. In order to actually get rid of all of the abuse and the trauma that goes along with it, and to escape from it, you have to heal from the emotional wound that abuse leaves, because it leaves quite the scar. And this doesn't just pertain to abuse, it also pertains to life-altering events, such as the one that I was talking about before, where my best friend committed suicide. So those things all require healing at some level, and if you don't heal from them, then they're likely to repeat themselves or come back up later, or still re-traumatize you over and over again. That will add to your exhaustion more than anything else. And so many times I see unresolved grief as one of the main reasons why a person is unable to fully move on and get healing. So there's 5 steps to getting better in healing your emotional wounds. Number 1 is to recognize that you're actually a victim, that you've been victimized in some kind of way, and that you have to recover from something. Number 2 is to assess your abilities. This may be something that you can do on your own. It may not be. You might need to get help from other people, but there's no shame in doing anything like that. You just have to understand what your abilities are. Number 3 is cleaning up your wound. Usually that means recalling the event, writing it out, talking it out. Writing a letter usually helps, so that you purge it out of your system and you actually get to see what that looks like. Number 4 is stitching up your wound. So seeking forgiveness, granting it to others. You can pray over it. You can, I have people often burn the letter that they have written in kind of a ceremony of sorts, as a way of releasing all of the trauma that was left behind in it. And the last is bandaging your wound, which is leaving the past in the past. Once you have gone through an event and you've made a decision that you're going to really, truly release it, and you have burnt your letter, then it truly is leaving it in the past and saying, okay, I'm done with that. I'm not going to keep rehashing it or reliving it anymore. So our last area that we're going to talk about are some of the external sources of exhaustion, which is handling difficult people. I love this little saying, dear God, please stop teaching me how to deal with difficult people. Amen, because I feel like that on some days, because there's a lot of difficult people that we deal with. Now, this is a good point in time where I would like you to mentally pick a person in your head that you can think of That is a difficult person for you to actually work with, for you to live with, somebody from your past, just whoever comes to your head right in the very front. So examples of some difficult people could be somebody who is a liar, somebody who's abusive, somebody who ignores you, somebody who's indecisive. All of those things can hold. Now, so let's talk about a little bit about what makes a difficult person so difficult. And this is when that cute little stats class that I took back in college came in very handy for me in understanding just what it means. So this is the standard deviation, meaning the mean score is the number one thing that you see at the very center of it. And there's a standard deviation of plus or minus of 1, which means that you are relatively the same as other people. And this goes for every single aspect of our personality. So let's just pick a random thing. Let's pick aggressiveness, for instance. So we can call it assertiveness, aggressiveness at the opposite end, and then we can do the very opposite end of a totally passive person. So assertive would be the same as others. So people who are assertive are relatively in the center. So then there are some people who are a little bit less than others or a little bit more than others. So those are the standard deviations of plus or minus 1 to 2. And so they're just a little bit more. And then we have ones that are way more. So very aggressive, which would be like hitting and hurting someone, or very passive, which would be not talking at all in the silent treatment. And so those are things that then, therefore, make a person very difficult to work with because it's outside of what we call normal behavior. So what looks like a normal trait versus an abnormal trait? Well, a normal trait is a persistent pattern of thinking, relating, and perceiving, meaning that it's everywhere. It's constantly persistent. It's common in most circumstances, so you will see it. It's very consistent across the board. There's a consistent viewpoint of themselves versus others, meaning that everybody is kind of the same. And it can be observed in a wide range of contexts. So that's what we call normal traits. The abnormal traits will look a little bit different. So those are personality traits that are very inflexible and maladaptive. They are omnipresent, meaning that they are there all the time. It doesn't matter, work, home, whatever. They are very resistant to change, will not move. They're very inflexible. We see an early onset in childhood and adolescence, and they can cause significant functional deterioration. It can cause problems in the workplace. It causes interpersonal relationships as well. So those are what we call the abnormal side. And on the abnormal side of that are what we call personality disorders. And these personality disorders are unbelievably exhausting. So if you've ever come across a person who is, for instance, narcissistic, which we will talk about in a second, they are very exhausting to work with and to be around. But so are people who are paranoid and antisocial, which covers, by the way, antisocial covers sociopaths and psychopaths. We have passive-aggressive people, so those are the people who will say one thing to your face and then say something completely different behind your back. Borderlines, those are the people who love you and then they hate you, so it's like this on-off kind of thing that you go through. The obsessive-compulsives are people who, we talked a little bit about obsessive thinking before, but they take it to a whole nother level of perfectionism and extremism that makes it very difficult to live up to their standards. So those are just a couple of examples of very difficult personalities to work with. So I want to talk a little bit about narcissists for a second, since they seem to be so prevalent in our culture right now. And there's a lot of talk about the millennial generation being the most narcissistic generation ever, and there's several theories that kind of go with the reasons for that. But most, and the number one thing that I've actually heard is that it's really my generation's fault, because we managed to raise kids who feel entitled to receiving trophies and awards for not really having achieved very much, and then they expect that as adults when that's not really the way the world works. And so that may or may not be true. I've also heard the philosophy that that because there was no massive economic downturn the way it was when I was growing up, that this generation has grown up without seeing any really hard times. That seems a little bit more realistic to me than anything else. So what is a narcissist exactly? Well, they believe that they are better than other people. They believe that that their talents and achievements outdo just about everybody else. They expect this constant praise and admiration. They believe that they're special and unique, and they expect to be treated as such. They fail to recognize other people's emotions or feelings, so they have little to no empathy. They expect others to go along with their ideas and plans. They tend to take advantage of other people. They express disdain for those that they believe are actually beneath them in some way. They are jealous and believe that others are jealous of them. They have trouble keeping healthy relationships. They set very unrealistic goals, and they have a fragile sense of self-esteem. So I'm sure that you have come across in your head a couple of people that fit this, and we won't do the politics of that right now. But let's just look at it from a spousal standpoint. So this is kind of a funny thing, right? Philosophy and Narcissism 101. Sit for a spell and listen to my list of why all my faults are all your faults. So that's pretty much what a narcissist does. They blame all of their problems onto somebody else. And they constantly are provoking the spouse. They'll threaten abandonment or divorce to get their way. They don't accept responsibility or apologize. Now, this also goes for an employer, an employee. It doesn't just have to be a spouse, by the way. They project their negative characteristics onto a spouse. They might blame their spouse for everything that has gone wrong. They insist that they are right, smart, powerful, beautiful. There's a lot of jealousy that arises. And when they're confronted, they have this thing where they love to play the victim card. So thinking back on the person that I asked you, if they are narcissistic, well, then we've just talked about them. But if they are some other kind of difficulty, let's talk a little bit about like what you can do to actually help yourself manage this stressful person, because we can't change them. Like, they are who they are, and sadly, and as much as we want to change them, we actually can't change them. But what you can do is manage yourself first, meaning that you can constantly keep a bird's eye view of what this person is doing and recognize, okay, that's dysfunctional. That's not a good behavior. That is not something that I want to repeat. It's not the kind of person that I want to be, and I don't have to be like them because I don't want to be like them. You can also set more reasonable expectations for yourself. When you see that a person is difficult, the biggest thing to do is to remain calm and very logical. Try to divorce yourself of emotion, because it's the emotion that they use to get you kind of wound up in their direction. So remove yourself emotionally and just focus on logic. Don't get lost into their vortex. Like, they have this like vortex that just sucks you in whenever they get upset or wound up or angry or start to rage. And so don't get sucked into that. Rather, constantly pull yourself away and step out of it. Do not become defensive, because when you're defensive and you start defending yourself against somebody who is coming after you, they just look for more reasons to go after you. And when you need to, walk away from them. That is the most important thing that you can do with a very difficult person, is to walk away. Another method that you can use is what I call the Hamburger Method, which is compliment, confront, and then in this case, this is a Big Mac method: compliment, confront, and compliment, meaning that you give them a compliment, then you tell them a confrontation, then you give them another compliment on the back end. And you can literally stop at the top half of that hamburger, and it works all by itself. So when I was a teacher, at some point in time, I had to send out these lovely little notes to parents telling them about their kids. And I would say, "Dear Mom and Dad, Johnny is failing my class because he hasn't turned any homework. Please be aware that he's going to get an F." Now, that would be confrontation, and that email would never be received well by a parent. However, if I did it this way, it was received much better. "Dear Mom and Dad, Johnny is a delight to have in my class. Every day he comes in with a huge smile on his face. However, he is failing my class. He's failing my class because he hasn't completed any homework, and he might get an F for the quarter. I know that now that I have talked to you about this, that we can work together to come up with a solution, because I want Johnny to succeed." When parents got that email, it went over much better. So the same philosophy that works in that environment can work in this as well. When all else fails when working with a difficult person or being around them, use some humor. Don't belittle or be sarcastic with them, but use a little bit of gentle humor. You can also predict their reactions a little bit so that you know exactly what's happening. And my favorite strategy is to say, favorite ending line is, thank you so much for sharing. When they complain about something, thank you so much. I really appreciate your input. And I just end it right there. Don't get defensive. Don't add it. Have an exit plan all the time. And remember, if you're dealing with a bully, bullies look for weak targets. So don't be weak. Stay strong. So what I would want you to do is to be able to go back through this and kind of evaluate for yourself, like, what has worked for you? How can you actually improve in your own journey of trying to eliminate exhaustion? What do you need more help in so that you can look forward to having a life that is much less exhausting and much more fulfilling? And now I will turn it over to the question and answer portion of our discussion.
Thank you so much, Christine. Really what an inspiring presentation. You know, I was receiving some feedback about how people really appreciated your openness and vulnerability in sharing your personal stories. You know, it's kind of, we all talk about, you know, the lows and, well, more so, I guess, the highs in life. And I think this presentation does a good job of shedding light and, I guess, breaking the silence that, you know, people are dealing with some difficult things internally, and how we can recognize those, address them, and live less exhausting lives. So let's see, we do have some questions that have come in.
Okay.
Let's see, the first one is, which one do I want to go with? I guess, what are some more key strategies that you would recommend for us to try to not only find but maintain that continual balance of that triangle that you showed us at the beginning between our behavior, feelings, and thoughts?
Yeah, one of the best things to do is to evaluate your own thoughts and emotions in a quiet space, like taking time out at the end of the day. So for me personally, I don't get much time during my day. My day is slam packed. So what I do though is on my way home, leaving my office and driving home, which is not a very long drive, it's about 15 to 20 minutes. I don't have any radio going on, and that's kind of my time to process those things. So if I felt anxious during the day, what was that anxiety about? What was it stemming from? If I was thinking about something over and over again obsessively, like what I talked about before, where is that coming from? And I kind of use that downtime on my way home as kind of my own self-check to make sure that I am dealing with all of the things that I have to deal with so that it doesn't build on or carry over to the next day, or even worse, carry over into my home life.
That's very good advice. And this next question is kind of, I guess, could jump off of that. What are some additional, well, you talked about the tree ring and using that, you know, your life-altering moments timeline and filling that in, as well as the example of writing a letter about maybe, you know, the difficult issue or trauma that you went through and then burning it to have a cathartic experience. Are there other activities or exercises like that that you would recommend for those of us that are exhausted and looking for a little freedom from that?
Yeah, there's something that we call mindfulness in our practice, and so it's kind of like the latest and greatest in the buzzwords, but basically what that is again, coming back to the idea of taking some solace time and being alone and becoming very aware of your feelings. Now, this is not something you can really do when you're driving, because you like to close your eyes, and driving and closing your eyes is not really a great idea to do. But just sitting in a very quiet space and becoming mindful of the stresses that your body is holding and where it is holding it, and finding ways of releasing that stress, that is another way of also helping to alleviate some exhaustion.
Thank you, Christine. We have a question. How do you deal with a difficult person who monopolizes conversations, doesn't allow you to get a word in, maybe talks over you constantly? What are some strategies there?
Yeah, so I like to use humor in situations like that. So I'll make a slightly sarcastic remark somewhere inserted, and usually you can kind of predict what you can say ahead of time, so you can have that down to kind of like insert and say something. So I use sarcasm a lot as a way of kind of toning that down. I also don't really encourage people to stay present in a situation like that. Like, you can always walk away. If a person is dominating a room or an environment, feel free to get up and walk away. You don't have to allow them to have center stage all of the time. And then you can kind of gain some influence with other people, like one person at a time, to kind of direct the conversation away from the person who is literally sucking the energy out of the room. And by doing that behind the scenes and kind of off to the side, you will find that you'll have a lot more influence and feel more in control of the situation, while the other person has no idea what's even going on.
Again, really great advice for our listeners there. We have another question that has come in that is in regard to the THINK acronym that you showed us earlier. And this individual would like to know, again, if you have other strategies that you would recommend to overcome obsessive thoughts and feelings of inadequacy.
I do. I have a favorite one that I have my clients do who really struggle with obsessive thoughts. And the strategy is simply this, and it's going to sound a little nuts when I say it, so just bear with me, is to have a 15-minute block of time. So let's pretend it is from 9 o'clock to 9:15 in the morning and at night that we call your obsession time period, meaning that you get to obsess as much as you want about whatever you want during that 15 minutes. But when that 15 minutes is over with, you're not allowed to obsess again until the next 12 hours comes around. And if you need to write down in your phone like what you want to obsess about because you're afraid that you're going to forget it, feel free to do that. But what's interesting is that my clients who have done this have found that their 15 minutes quickly moves to 10 and then to 5 minutes. And before they know it, they're down to just like a couple of minutes every day obsessing. And they've actually freed up hours of time that they have spent otherwise obsessing about things that they really didn't need to obsess over.
Again, I think a lot of us could relate to that. It's, you know, letting some of that steam out and releasing that pressure buildup. So another great strategy there for everybody. Moving right along, this question is about the narcissists that you were kind of describing, and a lot of what you were talking about were for that one-on-one interaction. But what if you are a bystander witnessing kind of this narcissistic interaction between two other people? How as the bystander could you intervene to help the situation? Or should you not?
Well, it kind of depends on what you're talking about. If we're looking
so I guess in like the workplace, it would be for this
like
environment.
Somebody bullying somebody else in the workplace?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so usually you know, especially if the person that's doing the bullying is a superior, a boss, or a supervisor, or a manager, I don't recommend interjecting in the moment. I recommend pulling the person aside after it's already happened and kind of seeing from them how they were feeling and what they were thinking and what was going on with them, and helping them to stand up better to what I call the bullying situation. Because this is a very real problem that happens in the workplace. And bullies are able to be successful when they have people that they feel are weak targets. So if you can help the person to demonstrate that they are not weak, that they have some strength, and highlight that for them, then they're able to stand up more. And so you can kind of like role play with them a little bit with what they could say or what needs to be said later on, or ask them, do you want me to like just walk over to you when I see this happening? Is that okay with you? But I would always get permission first before you do something like that, because you would never want to get caught in a situation where you have the bully and the other person ganging up against you. Like that's not a good scenario at all.
Right. That's a good way to think about it. Kind of step back from the situation to then be able to help them more strategically.
Right.
This one is just a question about some of your favorite books and or articles that are related to this topic that you would recommend to our listeners.
So I have a lot of favorite books, and that's probably my problem. I have like 2 bookshelves full of books that I love. So one of my favorite books, though, that I still refer people to is Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I'm a huge fan of that because I think that, especially in terms of the exhaustion factor, he really outlines an excellent time management strategy that is perfect for helping people to kind of organize their day. And while it might be a little outdated because I know it was written in the 80s, it still is very practical and useful for today. So that's probably my #1 book, I would say, that really does help and work with exhaustion. There's a lot of books that are written about difficult people and narcissism and how to handle it. One is Hurt People, and so that's a really good book because it kind of helps to explain what's happening. Stop Walking on Eggshells is another really good book. There's a book about narcissistic mothers that's excellent as well, and so those books about difficult people are very useful. And when you kind of figure out the kind of difficulty person that you're dealing with, and then you look for a book that kind of guides you, that's very useful as well. The Sociopath Next Door is one of my other favorite books because that's also very helpful. Most people are unaware of just how prevalent that could be, even in the workplace.
Well, so there for our listeners, there are a ton of options that Christine recommends. So definitely, I hope you jotted those down, or you can reach out to Christine to get that list again. We do have one final question. This is more of a broad one, but just tips to deal with someone who is always negative, no matter what the situation is, and no matter what the strategies that you may try. What if someone continues to exude that negativity?
So the way I see negativity is that you just have to let the person be and stew in their own stuff. Trying to pull them out of the negativity is only going to frustrate you, and it won't frustrate them. They're kind of happy where they are, and they're happy being the way that they are, and so you just got to let it be. And if they want to be negative, then you say, okay, that's your choice, and then you turn around and walk away. But trying to pull somebody out of it is only going to drive you nuts.
Short and simple. I definitely, that's really good advice. So hopefully, again, that helps our listener who sent in that question. Well, we are getting tight on the time frame now. We had some really great questions following a phenomenal presentation. And again, thank you so much, Christine, for taking the time to share with us some of those key strategies as well as those stories that have really impacted your career and your professional self. On behalf of the JMU Alumni Association, I want to thank you and our listeners today for joining in live and taking some time to focus on their own professional development. I will ask that you please take a moment to complete the survey that you will receive when you exit today's webinar, as your feedback helps us to continue to provide a tailored program for you, our alumni. I also hope that you'll join us for our next webinar on April 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's going to feature alumnus Eric Wagner and his presentation, Leaving It on the Road, What My Cross-Country Bicycle Ride Taught Me About Achieving My Goals and Living My Life. During his 33-day ride across the United States, Robert was able to identify valuable life lessons that he documented and shared with close friends and family on his blog before turning the experience into his first memoir to share with the world. So we really hope that you'll join us for that presentation. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be available and sent to you. So thank you, everybody, for joining. I hope you have a great afternoon, and go Dukes.